And I think as we now sort of look to this next session around interoperability and coordination around climate data, and I think to some of your points, Inda, I think there are these broader patterns around how we can have a system that integrates data with the context that's necessary from both countries, companies, citizens, communities. And so with that connect, I'm going to hand over to Michael Schmitz and his speakers. Michael, the spotlight is yours.
Thanks, Tony, and thanks for everybody who's part of this day. It's really important that we're taking on the issues in real time and are not, you know, in any way dropping the ball and moving forward. What obviously just about everybody on this call, I'm sure, is deeply engaged in some way or another is also the longer term, if you will, the existential crisis of climate change. We have set up before this a panel that was going to look at this, reflecting back from 2030, kind of a futurist reverse engineering perspective on how we got to a more optimistic future. I think in this moment, it's even more important to have that kind of perspective because we really are trying to figure out how to help give tools to humanity to be able to like make that path forward. So we're going to go ahead with a combination of discussion, but also have some of these panelists who are really amongst the global leaders in various parts of the climate change movement, both speak to their experiences and then offer their perspectives. So, you know, as I said, that we were looking back at how we got to where we are in 2030. I think what's key for all of these folks and for what we're talking about today is fundamentally the role of data and the role of time. You know, and I think it's critical for us to consider how we're going to build out a climate data infrastructure, if you will, to be able to have a transition to a low carbon economy. Speed is critical, but so is transparency, so is having a global data infrastructure and a complete climate data ecosystem so that anybody anywhere can be informed and take action. And I think that's one of the things that as we think about interoperability and think about how we're going to be able to build such an ecosystem at speed, you know, at the speed required, that we start to have these kind of discussions. And obviously that kind of ecosystem we're looking to build has to not just include GHG emissions, but water, natural resources, waste data. There's myriad data streams that need to be integrated in this. And obviously it has to accurately capture, record, and understand the implications of the data in a more sophisticated way than we have currently. And so therefore, we're looking at the need to deploy all of the emerging data technologies that we're already considering: blockchain, machine learning, sensor IoT data, and as part of this effort. So as I mentioned, I'm going to jump right into having folks. It's going to be much more informal than we previously imagined, but I do want to have the opportunity for our panelists to be able to talk about their work. As I mentioned, they've been leading in various capacities in the climate movement for some time, and you'll recognize, many of you will recognize these folks from different parts of your professional careers. We'll start with Randall. Randall Winston was the executive director of the California Strategic Growth Council, which is California state agency which integrates efforts to achieve the state's sustainable community and climate goals. He focused, among many things, on infill development, conservation strategies, and implementing the California's historic GHG and Climate Action Plan that was rolled out with AB 32. He previously served in Governor Jerry Brown's office as an advisor to the Chief of Staff. He helped with the implementation of the Jerry Brown's international climate policy, as well as executive orders on green buildings and zero emissions vehicles. There's a lot of other things he has done, and he is going to do many in the future. I will just now turn the spotlight without further ado to Randall and kick this off. And yes, you are on Spotlight. Thanks, Randall. Great to see you.
And great to see you as well, Michael. Thank you again for having me this morning, Tony as well, and all of you for being here. Hope you're staying safe and healthy. So, just by way of a little bit of table setting, I'm gonna talk about maybe two areas in particular, insofar as government's role and data-driven efforts to fight climate change. But from California perspective, 30,000-foot view, and many of you probably already know this. I think some of the things that have made California successful in the area of climate change include ambitious goals, a robust regulatory framework, and strong implementation. Ambitious goals, you know, we have aggressive greenhouse gas reduction targets for 2020, 2030, and out to 2050. Again, as many of you know, a robust regulatory framework really established by our Air Resources Board and our host of agencies, including in the areas of energy generation, transportation, buildings, natural and working lands, and land use, and then strong implementation. And this is the area that I really want to focus on, specifically in the area of land use, which I had an opportunity to work on with the Strategic Growth Council, and which has, I think, led to some really interesting outcomes. So you had AB 32 signed in 2006. We had SB 32 that later came on and signed to extend the GHG reduction goals out to 2030. Amidst that effort, in 2012 was passed SB 35, which was legislation that focused in on ensuring that our climate benefits and incentives accrued to disadvantaged communities. And the question quickly became, you know, how do you define disadvantaged communities that we know are most burdened by pollution and other environmental effects? Over some time, but relatively rapid time, was developed a tool called Cal EnviroScreen. And so Cal EnviroScreen, what it does was meant to identify communities that were most impacted by California environmental effects, along a host of metrics, about 20 metrics. So first, looking at burden of pollution, and specifically exposures, so PM 2.5, pesticides, other air pollutants, environmental effects, and that specifically means geographical proximity to cleanup sites, polluting facilities, groundwater contamination, and then a whole other host of metrics associated with population characteristics. Some of these you might imagine, of course, demographic or socioeconomic factors, as well as sensitive population characteristics having to do with biological makeup of communities. This includes prevalence of asthma, cardiovascular disease, etc. All of these metrics were put together by our state's California Environmental Protection Agency, and specifically our Office of Environmental Health, Hazards and Assessment, as well as our Department of Public Health, and workshopped over a year-long period with community groups, stakeholders, groups across the board to come up with this tool that identified on a 100-point scale the top 25% most burdened communities in the state. So I'll just stop right there and say, you know, it's great. There's been, just taking a big step back, a lot of efforts in California, not to mention the globe, I try to identify evidence-based ways to target populations that are most impacted by climate change. That really is just sort of step number one. I think where the rubber meets the road is making sure that a report like that or a tool like that doesn't just sit on a shelf, but is actually employed insofar as how investments and other regulatory tools are tied to people on the ground in a way that gives that tool regulatory effect. And that's what California has done since really 2012, 2013. We have a cap and trade system, as you all likely know. That cap and trade system generates billions of dollars per year, and at least 25% of those funds have to go to disadvantaged communities in California. And those communities are connected to those, the resources around California's cap and trade fund. So that's really been, I think, a helpful pipeline to ensure that some of the investments that come out of our state's cap and trade system accrue to those communities. The last thing I'll talk about is an actual program. So we have our goals. We have this thing called Cal Screen that identifies disadvantaged communities. Through the Strategic Growth Council, an organization that I formerly headed, as Michael mentioned, we created a program called Transformative Climate Communities. And insofar as implementation, I think one of the innovations has been ensuring, not just statewide control over the implementation of any sort of program, but strong partnerships with community-based organizations, local governments, and private businesses, with a focus on those communities most impacted. So looking at that Cal Screen tool, our program, we wanted to divide the most impacted communities. So the top 10% insofar as pollution burden and other population characteristics that have identified vulnerable communities. We know those are in California. They're primarily clustered in the Central Valley and in the Inland Empire. It's not that surprising. You have a large amount of agricultural and fossil fuel producing industries in the Central Valley, and legacy of environmental injustice that has led to communities that are overburdened. Similar elements in the Inland Empire. And we had $140 million to distribute in these spaces through a competitive process, where we required strong partnerships with communities to come up with a vision for transformation over a 5 to 10 year period that would be closely tracked to ensure specific outcomes of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, as well as producing other climate positive benefits. Usually in a lot of these programs, you sort of work with a government entity to give them the money, and they'll administer the funds at the ground level with a local set of organizations. One of the challenges, just to be sort of frank, is that there's a significant amount of distrust between a lot of the local governments and community-based organizations that had, maybe from the perception of community-based organizations, led to a lot of negative environmental outcomes. And so we created memorandums of understanding and agreements between community-based organizations and local governments and the state government to ensure that those funds were spent over time in a way that those benefits accrued to community-based organizations. So there's a lot more in there, but I'll stop right at that point, just to move on to other speakers, and happy to discuss further as the discussion continues. So thank you again, Michael.
Thanks, Randall. I do want to put a underscore, particularly like the unique nature in a good way of what was done in California in this arena, because you had to work, and Randall led this work across silos, not insignificant, between government and communities, not insignificant. Those things, and then be able to target monies fought for amongst all sorts of constituency to make sure it's gone to disadvantaged communities, impacted communities. I think this as a model, a working model of how government can support the various other parts of society, I think is one of those. It's not just something to highlight, but like, this is something we need to figure out how to implement at scale. So thanks, Randall. We look forward to like also how the next session deals with essentially digital finance, and the connections obviously will be direct to what we're talking about here. I do want to move on to be able to get some of our other folks on to talk, and then have enough time for some discussion. We're also thrilled to have Alicia Seiger join us. Hi, Alicia. Alicia is a lecturer at Stanford Law School and leads sustainability and energy finance initiatives at the Stanford Law Graduate School of Business and the Port Institute for Energy. She's both managing director of the Stanford Steyer Taylor Center for Energy Policy and Finance and the Sustainable Finance Initiative. She's also on the board of one of the globe's leading environmental business association series, and her work is focusing really on how to green the financial system. And without any further ado, Alicia, you're up. The spotlight is yours, and we look forward to hearing what you're doing.
Thank you. Thank you, Michael. Thanks for having me. Thanks for joining us, everyone, on the call. I just got back from my kids' spring break. We went to the family room and the kitchen. We cut the back lawn with scissors and filled out our census. It was memorable. And as you can see from my background, I'm joining you from an optimistic 2030.
Yes.
You can't totally see from the picture, but behind me, we've actually globally reduced emissions 45% below 2020 levels, and on our way to net zero by 2050. Here in this optimistic 2030 place where I'm visiting you from. You probably want to know how I got here. It wasn't just as simple as changing my Zoom background. It came down to three things: data, leadership, and humanity. Before I get into how those three things played out, I'm gonna just start with a look backward, and walk sort of through how we got to this place. So it started, back in the 80s, where climate was really seen as a science problem. There was a debate of whether the science was real and how to settle it, and that finally calmed down in the 2000s, despite best attempts to dispel and manufacture doubt. And then climate change kind of became more of an economic problem. The debate became more about, how much more is it going to cost to build green than brown? And that raged on in the early part of this century, lasting until kind of the mid-teens. And then, particularly starting with the electric power sector, it just got cheaper to build green. So it wasn't an economics question anymore. It became a finance question. And the question, evolved into the question of risk, understanding climate risk and how to allocate that risk, who was going to pay for it, and what do we do about stranded assets. And so from this financial crossroads in the 2020s, the key to success over the next decade was really a rapid proliferation of data and models to help sovereigns, investors, insurers, and businesses identify and price climate risk, and then a suite of supportive policies and a political climate that rewarded those who got proactive. And interestingly, the turning point really could be seen as the COVID-19 pandemic that swept the globe in 2020. So in that 6-month period, when global activity came to a halt and before doctors and scientists discovered therapies to manage the disease, several catalysts were actually quietly brewing that served the world well in this even larger threat of catastrophic climate change. So what was happening was voters and policymakers and investors started to connect the dots between climate and COVID and realized three things. First, they realized that climate change is not one discrete factor or even a set of factors. It's a macro disruption across all industries, all geographies, and all arenas. Second, they realized that climate change can really fundamentally alter economic systems. Before COVID-19, Americans really lacked a tragic imagination. They failed to grasp these reports about the value at risk from climate change. And the data at the time was very clear. There was an IPCC report in September of 2018 that totaled the economic impacts of climate and told us that even if we limited warming to 1.5 degrees C, we would still inflict $54 trillion in economic damage to the global economy. And if we stayed on a 2-degree pathway, it'd be 69 trillion, and the impacts went up from there. Another study at the time showed in the context of GDP that even if we achieved all of our nationally determined commitments through the Paris Agreement, it would still result in a 15 to 25% reduction in GDP per capita by 2100, and 30% if we kept on a business as usual pathway. The COVID-19 pandemic caused double-digit drops in GDP worldwide. Though the effect was temporary, it helped people really grasp this value at risk concept and understand that in climate, those losses were irreversible. And the third thing that people realized was that climate could cancel business as usual. There had been a tendency to see climate as optional or a policy bet, but as we learned, the pandemic wasn't an optional experience for people. If you were on the planet, you were experiencing it. And so we really learned to understand that to invest as usual was to take a bet against scientific principles and learn to trust our scientists and the value of having our leaders tell the truth. And that the more you delay action, the more you invite a volatile environment and an abrupt market correction that's not good for any parties. So we really learned the grave consequences of delaying action. So what happened in particular between 2020 and 2030 to get us to this utopian place where I'm standing today? I won't go into all the details of the post-COVID stabilization and stimulus programs, but suffice to say the Biden-Warren victory of 2020 was a game changer. Their visionary green industrial policies put the gears in motion to achieve the country's decarbonization targets and put people back to work building a net zero economy, including, importantly, transition pathways for workers and companies in high carbon industries. But zooming out, the success boiled down to really three things. One was data. I'm going to walk through how data played out across particular arenas. So the first was in climate risk modeling. So stress tests in particular revealed weaknesses in the financial system and exposed previously untracked sources of risk. Banks stopped lending to carbon intensive sectors because the risk was too high. Governments stopped subsidizing fossil fuels. This was actually easier to do after the oil and price demand shocks around the COVID pandemic. And in particular, we got much more sophisticated on transition risk modeling. We figured out how to put these, put details together to yield decision-ready information, and how to incorporate the dynamic nature of both physical and transition risks to incorporate path dependencies and feedback loops. Another application of data was in green financing. We figured out how to separate green finance from greenwashing. So green taxonomies really helped us understand what was green and what was marketing. At the time, in around 2020, it was estimated that there was between $12 and $30 trillion invested in ESG and sustainability strategies. It became clear that most of that was in fact marketing. Sadly, the green bond market was also exposed particularly in China, for labeling money as green when it was really just sort of moving around through different financial institutions and investing as usual. So we got really good at tracking green finance and learned how to identify investments in systems rather than products. And then on a sector level, data really played a role across multiple sectors. In energy, we finally moved from our 19th century Thomas Edison grid to a 21st century model that leveraged sensors and data to value flexibility services, transmission, and to develop the next generation electric power markets that enabled financing for systems with zero marginal cost. We figured out how to track wind and solar on a granular basis to predict resource availability and optimize the use of batteries on the grid. In transportation, we use data to map EV charging needs and really to help build the net zero transportation infrastructure. In buildings, advancements in sensors and materials allowed us to achieve net zero buildings and retrofit the existing building stock by allowing owners favorable financing terms for retrofits by being able to effectively track energy savings. In agriculture and land use, advances in data collection and processing helped everything from small farmers take advantage of financial resources to transition to sustainable farming practices, to optimize land use planning at the regional, state, and national level to solve for natural carbon sinks and sustainable land use. We found ways for data to help with the R&D process. We developed a global R&D engine to help direct money towards the hardest to decarbonize sectors and optimize that R&D process. Even found it helped in politics. We were able to use data to change the conversation among conservatives and climate deniers, to test messages and messengers, finally break through making climate a bipartisan issue. The next generation of carbon offsets were also benefited by advancements in data technologies. As companies pursued their path to carbon negative pledges, we got way more sophisticated with measurement and verification of natural carbon sinks, specifically soil sequestration and afforestation. And we developed a dashboard that could track corporate and government climate commitments and hold companies accountable, rewarding those that were making progress. So in sum, much greater measurement and transparency around climate risk and carbon emissions, mitigation and resilience strategies allowed us to reward reward the leaders and punish the laggards. The second really critical component was leadership. And that really started with the asset owners. These are the intergenerational pools of wealth that control the bulk of capital in our economy, about $100 trillion in sovereign wealth funds, pension funds, insurance companies, family offices, foundations, endowments. These asset owners set ambitious decarbonization and climate resilience targets and work toward them with transparency, accountability, and aligned incentives. They finally figured out that ESG does not equal climate risk, and got very sophisticated about developing data sources, tools, and strategies for measuring and managing climate risk and capitalizing on climate-wise investment strategies. A huge asset in that exercise was the establishment of mandatory climate-related financial disclosures for both physical and transition risk. These asset owners got rid of their siloed and unempowered ESG, CSR teams and fully integrated climate sustainability across their entire portfolio. They got rid of back testing because they realized that the past was not predicting future performance. They developed new benchmarks that took current climate and sustainability data into account. They developed compensation structures to align with science-based climate targets. And they prepared for what was called the policy ambition gap, to limit the shock to the economic systems when our policies finally got right-sized in scope and ambition. Science-based targets helped with this. They learned that asset managers and companies with deeply embedded climate expertise outperformed. They started to see this with the COVID economic collapse, and it really continued from there. And this applied in particular to supply chain management, because the more resilient supply chain, the more resilient supply chains were to stress, that the more those companies outperformed. This was another lesson from the COVID pandemic. And asset owners learned to lean into the concept of shared value, rewarding companies and business models that created value for all their shareholders, all their stakeholders, employees, society, and climate, while making money, because they realized that there was an imperative to help their beneficiaries. They also supported industry-level cooperation and collaboration, because again, asset owners realized that some problems had to be addressed in pre-competitive environments, including supply chain issues around decarbonization. And finally, it really came down to humanity stepping up to the challenge. The COVID pandemic taught us that we're all interconnected and that individual actions can save lives. Also, during that time, we learned to travel less. We learned to appreciate natural landscapes and resources. We learned to eat local, to cook, to make things ourselves, that we needed less stuff than we thought. We also learned that grinding the global economy to a halt is not healthy for people, especially those on the front lines of poverty and pollution. So we learned we really needed to find ways to sustainable development pathways. The SDGs provided a good roadmap for that. And in the end, we learned that nothing is guaranteed and that we need to work together to make the world we want. So that's my report from 2030. Thanks for tuning in. I'm happy to answer any questions in the discussion period. Oh, Michael, I think you're muted. There we go.
Yeah, well, wow, I'll say it again, wow, thank you. That to me is, like, I'm sure folks will agree, it's a thoroughly optimistic, but rooted in reality, data-backed, data-based assessment. And it's great to hear it, because I do feel like the work that we see in some places, like what's been going on in California and other jurisdictions, along with the kind of advocacy and academic leadership that you're providing, Alicia, I think we very well will get there in some variation by 2030. Yeah, so thanks. Actually, just even it's quite optimistic to hear the report back. I want to turn to, at this point, Martine. We have one other. Becky Chaplin-Kramer may not be able to hop on, but when she does, we want to bring in the perspective of the Natural Capital Project, which is really it's a pretty unique and important project. Started at Stanford, but it's a global project looking at how to integrate natural resources in a non-extractive, non-externality focused way. We hope to get her on, and in one form or another, they'll be engaged with this. But I want to turn to Martine now. Martine Wainstein is the head of the Yale Open Innovation Lab, resident fellow at the Center for Business and Environment at Yale, and research manager at the Digital Currency Initiative, the MIT Media Lab. He is doing a lot of focused research, including with Angel Su at the Yale, NUS, Singapore, initiative around climate, looking at a climate lab, a data lab, to be able to take on some of these things. You know, I'd turn it over to you for like the nuts and bolts of how we're going to experiment and scale our way to this hopeful future.
Thank you very much, Michael, and everyone, to make this happen. It's really a pleasure to be able to share these important discussions from the intimacy of our homes. I think that's quite unique. And also thank you, Alicia. I think you've covered most of the things that I wanted to say, so I think we're going to keep this very short. I don't know if you noticed, you did steal a couple of smiles from a lot of faces while you were talking, which was great. So I'm just gonna, I'm inspired by the prompt as well, the 2030. I'll do a chronological kind of stepwise things. First, for the last 2 years, we've been working on a global climate accounting system and the need for one of those. What does that entail? How does data and technology fits into that? One of the things that inspired that 2 years ago was we were researching a bit more how blockchain and distributed ledger technologies could fit within the climate space. And I've interacted with a lot of climate scientists that have been involved in managing the carbon budget and calculating the carbon budget. And it was, to me, a logic to say, well, here's one single account that we all share. It's our atmosphere. And that is a huge accounting problem that we can bring in a lot of trust into how we all connect within that shared account. And that led to a lot of research on how do distributed ledger technologies, or DLTs, fit into the climate space in the context of the Paris Agreement. And that led to a lot more policy engagement. So that was carbon budget management is very much at the physical level. But when we go deep into the Paris Agreement level, there's a lot more accounting gaps. And that leads us to today. And I probably have kind of 3 comments to say around the climate COVID kind of intersection. One's the optimistic side is we've one of the hard things around climate change is behavior change. And we've seen how habits can be turned around fast. And one of the key things that I think Alicia pointed out as well, is we realize that we're interconnected finally, and that we are part of a single planetary family, and that our individual actions actually save lives, actually connect. And that's something that in the climate space has always been a challenge, but that's, I think, an area of optimism. The second point is that we've seen the economy and stocks crash, our economic value decline, but yet at the same time, we get a lot of pictures from a cleaner Venice canals in Italy, and you know, cleaner spaces here in Los Angeles, cleaner in China. So the ecosystem has the capacity to regenerate, but we now can see that these things are not necessarily linked. Ecosystem value and economic value are not connected, and data is also going to be very important around that. A third part is that the economic hit that this will produce will make us have to consider a climate New Deal, a Green New Deal, however we want to call it, as a very important element for job creation, green value to get us out. And that's a point of where we're at. So with that as a groundwork, I'm going to go up to 2030. And indeed, we kept in track to net zero by 2050. So we're now roughly around halving our emissions relative to 2020. We still have to halve our emissions again by the next 10 years. And we deeply recognize that 2050 is not the end goal. We have 50 more years of negative emission to 2100 to stay within 1.5. But the success of the last 2 years have been on 2 main things. One is we've really addressed the accounting gap. And I'll talk about 3 points of the climate accounting gap that we identified in 2020 that we've addressed. The first point is the linkage between physical Earth data and consensus, which is around carbon budgets, the actual temperature anomalies, and the accounting that we do at the world stage. Let's say UNFCCC COP level, our global stock takes are finally linked, automatically linked. We don't have to wait for a set of researchers to compile the UNEP gap report to tell us what's the difference. we can almost see that in real time. We've created a double entry bookkeeping system where we understand the physical state of the planet and all of our world actors, and these things coincide. And so that's accounting linkage between what I would say Earth physical world, the human world. The second important climate accounting gap that we really solved is the linkage between non-state actors and state actors. Non-state actors like subnational governments, cities, provinces, states, companies, organizations, and individuals are not directly accounting into the Paris Agreement. They do that indirectly. And we solve this by creating nested accounting protocols where the pledges and the tracking that's done at one jurisdiction nests to the next. So when a city defines a climate pledge, it nests within the state and it nests within the nationally determined contribution automatically, because this accounting is done at a spatial level. So we've really brought in next level GIS and Web3 protocols to simplify how we do this across the entire political jurisdictional scale, right? And this also has unlocked a lot of new regulatory mechanisms that are not so much around things that have come from top down, but more of what it enables in the participatory nature of non-states to state level accounting. The third important accounting gap is that in 2020, we didn't really have a clear framework for how individuals and companies and states actually do their accounting relative to, let's say, IPCC guidelines of what goes into a global stocktake. And we figured out incentive mechanisms to do that. Because actually doing that makes the greenhouse gas inventories of countries extremely easier, because they don't have to be analyzing all the data sets. They actually, everything kind of rolls up to the national level, that rolls up to the UNFCCC level. And this is, and the fusion of these three accounting gaps has solved something very critical. Back in 2020, we had achieved high level of data integration at the corporate and the financial level that we were able to do financial and corporate reporting 4 times a year, right? We actually, that really created us a short-termism of quarterly basis. And we expected to do our global climate financing once every 5 years. So that was upside down. You know, now we could do global stock takes almost in real time. So that's what I would say the accounting gap. But the next huge gap was the data and technology gap. In here, we were able to leverage the technology that we already have, but make them quite robust and integrated. IoT and the value of sensors, both in remote sensing, but ground, the role of AI and big data to be able to manage and sense make about what those sensors are saying, and to be able to leverage distributed ledger technologies and blockchain to keep track of that over time so that we have a common ledger of truth about either we are tracking ecosystem state over time or we're tracking. So whilst those 3 accounting gaps that I talked really helped us deal with it at a spatial level, this helps us at a time level, is how do we monitor climate value over time? Because that is what allows us to actually mint credits, certifications. Credits and debits are key units that we've identified, and we can almost use tokenization dynamics to be able to simplify that process. But essentially that what in climate would be MRV, monitoring, reporting, and verifying, we've significantly digitized that whole process. It actually means that certifying climate value, whether it's land-based or in energy, is a lot cheaper because the climate standards we had in 2020 were analog. It requires an auditor to fly all the way to Indonesia to audit a forest to understand the things. Now we really are able to leverage next-gen remote sensing for that. And the final thing is, again, on linking that to finance, because if we now are able to digitally and third-party and trustedly verify climate value, and we've solved the spatial jurisdictions, we can now really integrate how we finance projects on the ground across the world, and how that climate value or the mitigation outcome that comes out of that can also be well distributed without the risk of double counting. Now, one of the key important parts of that is we because of the economic crisis in 2020, we really understood that financing infrastructure at the community and local level was key. And for that, it really helped unlock climate finance to remove a lot of the frictions that happen when we deploy capital before it goes from the top level pools of capital to the local communities. We were able to significantly reduce those frictions and understand how to clearly translate dollars per climate value and create a whole set of new green jobs at the community level. That's really what kind of brought us out of that 2020 situation. And I think that's how I would probably frame not only the story, but how we've also geared our research and our work. So I would leave it up to questions, and hopefully that was brief enough to keep us in time.
No, it was great, Martin, and the kind of the detail on both the accounting but also technology infrastructure that both is being built, being conceptualized, and needs to be built is spot on. It reminds me of kind of one of the great values that comes out of the decentralization movement, which is to actually give people the tools and knowledge and capability to act with real data anywhere, anytime, right now. And I think it leads to this other part of this discussion that Alicia touched on as well. It's about accountability to people, that people need to be able to have access to this data specifically, and not just through intermediaries, not even through if it's our guy, White House or not. It's about actually having access to data now. And I think that's where the climate accountability part of this really comes to the fore, something that we're going to be talking about a little bit later, but real efforts right now to, for instance, mandate corporate carbon emissions data across all scopes right now so that people can act in all sorts of different ways on it. So with having, thank you, Martin. I wanted to, I don't know, Becky, I haven't seen you join. I'm not going to call you out if you're not, and it's kind of, I would love to actually open up, and I think Martin, Alicia, and Randall all can unmute yourselves. I'd love to be able to open up for both engagement amongst you all, but also for folks who have questions or comments or thoughts. I mean, obviously there's a lot to dig into here. And the first too many conversations.
I have a question. Okay.
Yes, hey, yes.
Hey, great. So thank you everyone for, that was all very illuminating. I would be curious amongst the panelists to know how, what's going on with COVID has challenged or changed, some of your assumptions about how government and data would play in tackling the climate crisis. I mean, just from my perspective, for example, the fact that we weren't prepared, right? Like, and not just American government, but I think globally, Europe wasn't prepared. I mean, it's very clear Europe wasn't prepared. Some countries in Asia seem more prepared than others with respect to COVID, but it's obviously very clear that we're going to have to engineer our way out of this somehow in a way that I think we fail to have the imagination to do that. And I suspect that when climate catastrophes start happening, as they will, we're going to be having the same emotions that we have today. So I'd be curious, looking to see what's happened. Does that change your perspective? Has it, first of all? And secondly, what avenues of research become critical now, in your view, to get to these, futures where we've kind of dealt with the issue? So I would just kind of be very curious to see what's changed in your view of anything.
Maybe we can start with some thoughts, but please, Alicia and Martin, chime in. I think with a a lot of the advocates that I've worked with previously, again, predominantly in California, I think much of the change in discussion with regard to government activity has been in the area of resiliency. So for some years, California, and particularly our cap and trade regulatory framework, was focused on mitigation strategies, reducing greenhouse gas emissions and otherwise. And I'd say for at least the past 5 or 6 years, there's been an increasingly explicit effort to think through and fund resiliency strategies. A lot of that's been driven by, at least in California, before COVID-19, the drought that took place in 2013, 2014, 2015, and then of course the succession of wildfires. But now I think resiliency and the conversation around resiliency has expanded dramatically. I'll talk about a couple of areas I think where we're seeing some explicit strategies that might find their way in regulation over the next year. So one is in the area of broadly just transition, which refers to changes in the workplace, particularly employees who work in industries that are polluting or otherwise are going to experience dramatic transitions due to climate change. Now we're obviously seeing very different effects with regard to workers induced by the crisis. I'll just sort of mention one in California with a lot of the employees who are considered essential and are working and have protections or not that they previously did not have before the virus. And it's just leading to a lot of discussions around opportunities to engage with employers in a different way, which could in turn, I think, be beneficial for changing over industries in the long term to incentivize greater resiliency and in turn greater reduction in our greenhouse gas emissions. So I think that's one area where we're seeing a lot of discussions. But Alicia and Martine, I'll turn it to you guys.
I'm happy to go. Thanks, Randall, for pointing that. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Alicia.
No, I was saying go ahead. I'll bet last.
Thanks, Inder. To start, I hadn't really put that much thought to it, and my initial thought that I'd like to share did not encompass what Randall just said, which I think is very important, because we think about finance in terms of mitigation and adaptation, but adaptation is always left behind, and that's really where resilience building is very important. So if we finally are able to understand the value of finance and climate adaptation and the whole scope of that preparedness, this definitely really helps us make a point there. What I was going to say is, obviously, one of the things that climate and COVID shares is that they're both battles with an invisible enemy in many ways. And so for that, having eyes on what's happening is very complicated. It really depends on data, and everyone counts. And so that requires mapping basically everyone and their current status. So we've seen how some very fast reactions from government were done because they already had a huge level of control over citizen data. But then that has the other kind of negative side, is the way to solve this is to have Big Brother watching you all the time, and it actually erodes privacy. So back into my comments around decentralization technology, the role for decentralized identifiers as a unit, a technological unit that helps in, let's say, the blockchain or DLT space are used a lot, and there's a lot more research happening on this space, becomes a lot more important. There's ways of creating a credential for who you are and your status that it has already zero knowledge proof, where someone that has to verify it does not have to access your entire profile. That just basically needs certain simple answers, yes or no, which allows you to own your data, right? This has been a holy grail around data privacy for a while. For example, we work actively with the province of British Columbia, Canada, that developed their own digital trust service based on, they're the maintainers of a hyperledger framework on DIDs, and they have an internal in-house team because of that. So it's kind of like unheard of for a subnational government to do that. But those are the type of things that are extremely important. how are you able to monitor that without infringing into privacy? So that's, I think, something that important around climate and obviously COVID.
Yeah, great responses from Randall, Martine, and I don't want to take too much time because I want to leave time for other questions, and there are 1,000 ways to answer that question in terms of different threads. But one thing that first came to mind for me was the questions around the intersection of climate and COVID as it relates to oil and gas markets. I mean, there's been a perfect storm affecting the economics of supply, and how that plays out over time is going to be a very interesting and critical question. Someone brought up earlier state enterprises. I think, you know, how state-run oil and gas companies respond to this is going to be an interesting question. How private companies decide to move forward in terms of their investment in new technologies and in their resource development strategies. So I think there's I'm anchoring on your research the question, because I think that's an area where a good deal of research could be done to inform good decision making for policymakers and business leaders going forward, to take this moment of an extreme shock to a core tenet of our global economy and look to build that build strategies that free us from our addiction.
Yeah, and I think the moment was already upon us prior to COVID crisis and the climate, broadly speaking. If you think about the mass movements, if you will, that have been really emerging with real force, and particularly in the last year, and now you're having the attention of constituencies organized. You have data folks, and then you have the imperative of the now. I think there are opportunities to have informed, well, let's call it what they are, political movements that actually drive these policies in a way that I think I don't think we've seen to date. And I think obviously the time is critical, but I think that for folks who are working on this stuff to be able to engage more actively with those movements and to be able to have those strategies informed by both the sophistication of this panel and then also the technologies, I think is very encouraging. And obviously what it looks like, who knows? It'll look very different in a lot of different places in different ways. But I do think that opportunity is there now, especially Martine, as you talk about the decentralized technologies meeting with a kind of a decentralized organizing principle, but then also having those very informed government leaders, the folks like Randall, who have taken the best of what government can do and kind of use it as something for the people, by the people. So we are mindful that we only have 5 minutes on a panel that probably could go all day. I'd love to have, if there are other folks that have either question or insight or whatever else, we can get, and feel free to just hop on right now.
We had a request from Sharik Syed, who's based at Stanford at the Kuznetsky Global Collaborative. Sharik, are you online? Are you okay to share that comment?
Thank you. Thank you very much for this panel discussion. I've learned so much from all of our discussion. In terms of COVID and the timeliness of our response, both to that and to climate change, I think as we said, it already happened. And it happened quickly. We can already see the impact of behavior change on the climate. We have seen that all over the world. The question from finance perspective is that, can we reward that behavior in the near term? So there's a feedback. I think often one of the most fundamental thing is that we are working at institutional level, the multinational level. but there's also a response we need at the individual level, both for COVID and also for climate change. And I've been working on Greta's students, the Fridays for the Future, and helping them with the financial platform that they could really come up with the impact more than having Fridays being a day of striking. So in that context, that work has been going on for the last couple of years, but this recent crisis made me realize to share with you, can we act now? And I mean, before April 30th, before we get back to the so-called becoming normal again, which may not happen anytime soon, but it may. So being optimistic about restoring the economy, I'm certainly excited, but there's a lot of issues that we talked about, all the way from privacy and understanding how we can really participate in a safe way with each other. Not only climate change is a challenge for long term, we ourselves are really involved as virus has weaponized ourselves. So we are now not safe to each other. So we are now not only looking at the carbon and greenhouse gases, the invisible, but so is virus. But now we need to be safe, not only from the climate, but from each other. There are many ways we can collaborate locally. And President has said that we should go down to state. The states are looking at further down to counties. Counties are looking for cities. And then we are now, whether or not we can go shopping in our neighborhood, is it safe? I think the regional issues and local issues are fundamental for our climate as well as COVID response. And coincidentally, they have come together. So I will urge our panel, our colleagues, to really ask this question. Can next 30 days or next 2 months be an opportune time for us to enact a prototype with what we already know? Of course, it will only get better in years to come and months to come, and we're doing that at all levels. So in that respect, I want to conclude by asking us to see what is possible. I'll be happy to join in from the student Fridays for the Future high schoolers and giving them a financial feedback that what they have done already is worthy of acknowledgement, and can they continue to some extent under what feedbacks they can work forward. So I will have quite a bit to share, but I just wanted to thank you for the opportunity for just introducing these perspectives in today's discussion.
No, absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you. I think the this idea of really understanding individual behavior change, but also the danger of a rebound effect for the worse from the perspective of climate is very real. And I think you reflected well, I think that's this concern, but also opportunity. We actually have people now changing dramatically their behaviors, individual behaviors. What can we do to try to reroute the river in a more sustainable direction? Any from our panelists? I know we have to jump to our next panel very soon, but Tony, you have a thought.
Well, I just wanted to say, I mean, to the extent that Randall, Alicia, Martin, you're able to stay just for a little longer, this next hour is almost, in a sense, viewing it from the other perspective of a lot of the things that you touched on around the data, but especially the leadership and the humanity and the accounting systems. I think when we have been often as an ecosystem looking at the technology, I think, speaking in generalities, I think that leadership and that human piece has been often underplayed. And it was with such delight that I listened, first of all, to you, Randall, speaking about these different kinds of more human value flows that are contextualized in the underlying needs of local communities. And I think the beginning of that and how that plays into the leadership and the humanity piece that Alicia was talking about is so essential to bring to the fore as part of these prototypes and the building of things that Sharik is talking about. And I know I just want to give a plug to what Martin is working on, along with Professor Angel Su, who was mentioned, and Noah Thorpe is involved, and Noah's part of the organizing committee for this gathering. There will be a ongoing series of collabathons, hackathons, involving how we go about using this data in more human ways, promoting that kind of on-the-ground leadership, and bringing into play some of these alternate and potentially more important value flows beyond the baseline bottom line. And so thank you. I just reflecting what Michael was saying, Alicia, Randall, Martin, thank you so much for laying that out, especially I think the things that drew a lot of smiles, which were these optimistic visions. And I think figuring out how we can continually as a group and a community share these meta narratives and make them available, not be in any way proprietary about them, but make them available, recognize at a local level. It is through taking these narratives and countering some of the more I think destructive, hateful narratives that might be emerging or might be usable in situations like this, but offering that hope. I think.
Can I make a quick link between Sharik's question and what?
Yeah, please do, Martin. Go ahead.
I mean, I think Sharik, you posed something kind of very important. Is like, can we reward behavior change in the short-term basis? And we put some question thought around that. From like, well, people are in their homes and their carbon footprint is lower. Can we reward that? You know, from a point of view of like official climate accounting, that's extremely hard because it produces. It's hard to prove additionality and hard to verify that behavior change. But from a point of view of a more informal kind of climate value creation, there's a lot more room for creativity there. And the linkage of the collaborative hackathons that we launched last year, the Clubathons, is a different way of bringing in youth action into, let's say, hacktivism, climate hacktivism, to bring in new ideas and new models that eventually could go into a more official accounting mechanism, but at least it allows us to even possibly gamify some of these behavior changes. So that's kind of like a remark that I wanted to make.
Thank you so much.
Brilliant, Martin. That's a beautiful, beautiful segue then into this.